Bendy and the Ink Machine is a first-person horror game with a unique art style. It sees a man named Henry returning to the animation studio he used to work at to find it's become overrun with an immense machine and being stalked by strange creatures. Atmosphere. The very start of the game sets a tone with this feeling of isolation, being watched, and supernatural fear when things move on their own and doors open and close without any sign of life. This for me was probably the best part of the game, before Chapter 2 came along and things started changing. The atmosphere sort of gets turned off when you're handed a weapon and told to beat up some basic looking ink monsters. The combat I find detracts heavily from what they established in Chapter 1 and it just never really recovers. The game has a few tense moments later on, but after Chapter 1 ended I sort of felt like the atmosphere just went with it. Walking the halls of the studio didn't induce much of anything. The only monsters I'd encountered weren't much of a threat once I was armed, and even when I wasn't, it was too easy to outrun them. No Harry Masons. Scares. Something the game does well is introducing an element that at first seems pretty frightening, but after dealing with it you realise there's nothing to be afraid of. There are a lot of things that are designed to scare you, from the projectionist stalking the halls of the areas he roams to the assorted ink monsters and Bendy himself, but very few of them are frightening after you learn how they work. Whilst it's easy to outrun them and vaguely comical how they stop chasing you after witnessing you going into one of the protective cupboards, the biggest flaw with all of these is the lack of consequence for death. The game doesn't punish death in the slightest. Even when I was in the projectionist's lair, when he did catch me whilst I was searching for ink hearts, I was just sent back to the nearest Bendy statue and I still had everything in my inventory. The few scares I did receive are when Bendy himself appears. The whole room starts to pulsate and you hear a heart beating as he slowly walks past you. Even though I knew there wasn't a consequence for dying, this made me fearful. Then there were some visually striking moments from the start of Chapter 4 when I thought the game was turning around, but they were never used again. Besides Bendy himself, who makes very few appearances, the lack of threat really hinders the game's experience. Still no Harry Masons. Sound design. Whilst I love the creepy violin music that plays over certain sections of the game, the volume of the music seems too low when I'm exploring. It doesn't feel like the game is giving me an eerie silence, but the music isn't present enough to provide anything else, so it just feels weak. The sound effects are all nicely done. The heartbeats when Bendy appears and all the ink splattering on the ground sound great, and when you consume a can of Bendy's bacon soup it sounds forced and unpleasant to me, which I found made the optional task of consuming the stuff a little more unsettling. There's some nice directional audio. You can usually tell where an enemy is quite clearly based on the noises that they make. The audio logs are all very 30s era and the lines themselves are usually entertaining, especially Wally Frank's. That's one Harry Mason. Gore. Instead of blood, everything is ink, which makes sense. It's only when you think about what it signifies that ink spurting out of everything and falling from the ceilings makes things a little bit more unsettling. That's two Harry Masons. Story. Sent by his former boss Joey Drew to investigate the studio, Henry arrives and is quickly ensnared by the inhabitants of the machine. The story to me seemed extremely rushed because of how short the game is. It really felt like they were trying to condense the entirety of BioShock into about 3 hours of game. Characters came and went very quickly, some weren't built up at all before you met them and defeated them, like the constructor of the Bendy Park, Bertram Piedmont, who's introduced in an audio log, and about 10 minutes later you're facing off against a fairground ride with what we can assume was his face in it, and then he's never mentioned again. Whereas other characters like Wally Franks didn't really reveal much of anything about the story but had more audio logs than all the other characters combined. Near the end of the game you're introduced to two new characters who you lose track of right before the final boss. The pacing was all over the place and it was hard to pay attention to the story when the gameplay involved lots of mindless busywork, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. With a premise like this, I came into the game expecting a lot more of it than I was given. Without an atmosphere, the gameplay seemed dull. Without punishment for death, the scares felt impotent, and with a rushed story, the entire thing felt a bit meaningless. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that like Wally Franks, I was out of here. I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews on the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.